Good afternoon and welcome to Stewardship's first dialing of 2020. My name is Lauren and I manage our events here at Stewardship. I'll be your host on today's dial-in. Today I will also be joined by our resident experts Alan Hough and Stephen Mathews, who are both senior consultants here at Stewardship. And we will also be joined by Jackie Fletcher, who leads our Treasurer Services. If this is your very first dial-in with us, or if you're not fully aware of all that Stewardship do, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about us. Stewardship's vision is for the world to encounter Jesus through the generosity of his church. We seek to achieve this in three key ways: by inspiring greater generosity, by strengthening Christian causes, and by making giving easy. The purpose of the dial-ins is to equip and encourage you in the important role you are doing within your church or charity, and by extension, to strengthen the Christian cause that you represent. If you'd like to find out more about how we could support your church or charity, take a look at our website or contact John Keskes, our Head of Partnerships. His details should be on your screen now. Please note that if you'd like to receive the follow-up materials from today's call, including the podcast recording and briefing papers, you'll need to ensure that you are signed up to the Treasurer Dial-In mailing list. If you haven't already done so, you can find the sign-up form at www.stewardship.org.uk/dial-in. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page. So, let's start on today's agenda. We have a couple of tax-related mosquito effects for you, those small annoying things that come back to bite us, and these will be followed by a review of some longer-term issues. The topics that we will be discussing are mosquito effects, corporate criminal offence, and there may be trouble ahead, part 2, longer-term issues, including Charity Commission Inquiry Report, working issues, and pensions and church charity employees. We'll then have our Q&A section to finish off the call. Thank you to those of you who have sent in your questions by email already. This really helps us to plan our content to your needs, and we will address these during the Q&A session. Now, we encourage participation, so if you have any questions on the call today, please do use the chat function within Zoom to ask them, and we'll answer as many as we can during the call. In case you aren't sure how to do this, if you've joined us via the webinar today, you will see a chat icon on your screen. Click in here to type your questions. Just make sure you send these to all panelists to ensure that we will see your questions and be able to answer them. Those who have dialed in purely on your phone, I'm afraid that you won't be able to ask a question on the call, but hopefully the resources we send out afterwards on the call will be sufficient in answering your questions that you may have. Now let's begin with the first item on the agenda, which is corporate criminal offence, which is brought to us by Stephen.
Thank you, Lauren. Now, 2017 saw the introduction of a new corporate criminal offence, which is now being rolled out. It makes a criminal action of failing to prevent the criminal facilitation of tax evasion. That's all a bit of a mouthful. It is intended to prevent executives who help to evade tax hiding behind company protection. But it applies to all corporates, including incorporated churches, which means charitable incorporated organisations, that's CIOs, as well as company charities, and puts the church itself and its trustees at risk in the event that an offence is proved. It doesn't apply to charitable trusts, but with trustees having personal liability in the direction of travel on tax issues, I would advocate the same steps for all charities. The key point is that you can be criminally liable without the trustees being actively involved. To be proved, 3 elements must be present. Criminal tax evasion, that's either in the UK or foreign tax, must take place. This can happen in churches, as you'll see in a minute. Secondly, an associate person of the church must deliberately and dishonestly facilitate that evasion. This can be any employee, a volunteer, a contractor, or agent. So your church elder, administrator, or volunteer youth worker would be included. And thirdly, the church must have failed to prevent the facilitation. They don't need to have actively done anything. It only needs the trustees not to have done enough to prevent it. So each charity needs to have reasonable procedures to prevent criminal tax evasion in their charity. Take a moment to think about these situations which we have seen or heard about in churches. And remember, the person facilitating the evasion has only to be an associate to the church, not necessarily an employee. Firstly, making cash payments to a supplier to avoid VAT, or to an employee to allow them to avoid tax or claim benefits. Secondly, changing the documentation on one of the church workers so that it fits that of a subcontractor rather than what is really the case of being an employee to avoid PAYE and national insurance. Or, as a third example, pretending a payment for benefits provided is a donation, e.g. providing a donation receipt to enable a corporate donor to claim tax relief when it isn't actually a donation at all. The Charity Tax Group has written some helpful guidance for churches and small charities explaining situations where the offence might occur and suggesting actions for trustees to consider to best protect their church or charity. Now, in my own church, we're writing some policy for employees and volunteer officers and documenting a simple risk assessment to show that we have in place reasonable procedures to prevent tax evasion in our organisation. Now, I don't think it's urgent, but since this is essentially about creating simple policy and communicating that to relevant people in the church, I do recommend taking these simple steps and not ignoring or forgetting this. Those Charity Tax Group documents, we will provide links to them in the follow-up materials to this call. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That's so good to know. Now, our second mosquito effect, There May Be Trouble Ahead, Part 2, will also be given to us by Stephen.
Yes, indeed. This is part 2 because in the last dial-in, we used the lyrics of Irving Berlin's song to warn about the government's implementation of the EU's fifth money laundering directive, which requires a trust register to be established, then it was no later than 10th of March 2020. In October, we gave the advice to be aware of what is up and coming, to keep an eye on future announcements. This is one of those announcements. On 23rd of January, the government published its plans, and on the 24th of January, issued a technical consultation which closes on the 21st of February, so 1 week left. The really good news is that the consultation includes the following paragraph. It's 3.17 if you're interested. It says this: charitable trusts are subject to different rules depending on where in the UK they operate. Although many charitable trusts will be registered with a charity regulator, the Charity Commission Northern Ireland, the Scottish Charity Regulator, there are several exceptions. The government proposes that charitable trusts are not in scope to register because the risk of these kind of trusts being used for money laundering or terrorist financing activity is low. So, that's great. We think it's now unlikely that any normal charity will have to register. But we are sounding a cautious note. We're a little cautious given that some of the words are not exactly clear. For example, trusts is not defined in the regulations themselves at all. And secondly, since the draft amending regulations refer to excluding a trust for charitable purposes is registered as a charity exempt or accepted with the UK charity regulator, and that is not clear what they mean, some clarification and certainty from HMRC would be very useful. And we are waiting for this. In fact, at this very moment, there is a meeting with one of my colleagues in HMRC to see whether we can get it clarified. However, at this point of time, our reading, supported by other lawyers, is that Northern Ireland charities waiting to be registered are not exempt, although we're sure that they are meant to be. Plus, some funds within corporate charities are not exempt, but again, we're sure that they were meant to be. Now, the new date that's relevant for mandatory registration is March 2022. So that's 2 years away. So we should be sorted out by then. So our conclusion is we want to clarify what exactly is the music we have to face in the hope that there won't be any dance to be danced, as per Irving Berlin. But anyhow, it's good news, but it's not certain yet. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We're now going to look at some longer term issues. First up, a Charity Commission inquiry report from Alan.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, of all the monitoring cases that have been handled by the Charity Commission in the last year or so, 28, and that's just under 2% of those, involve Christian charities. With other cases expected to follow, the issue of governance within Christian churches and charities remains high profile. A recent inquiry report onto a church based in North London is a case in point. Just to give you some background, the church account showed annual income over a recent 5-year period ranging between £400,000 and £900,000. Those accounts had all either been audited or independently examined, but without exception, they were all filed late at the Charity Commission. The Commission's inquiry into this church led to a damning report, resulting in the whole trustee body standing down and being replaced. The original trustees have subsequently been disqualified from acting as charity trustees in the future, but so far it appears that no financial penalties or other sanctions have been imposed. There were numerous issues identified in the inquiry, but 3 in particular were highlighted. Firstly, unauthorised trustee remuneration. The trustees received significant payments that were not allowed for by the governing document. Some were clearly for remuneration, others were argued by the trustees as the reimbursement of expenses incurred on behalf of the church. The inquiry found that there was insufficient evidence and supporting documentation to support this claim, with the charity's position not being helped, as many of the payments were round sum amounts. Secondly, there was a failure to manage conflicts of interests. Although as required by its governing document, the charity had 3 trustees, 2 were married to each other. As a result, the inquiry found that for a period of more than 10 years, there was only 1 independent trustee, and that the church had done nothing to identify or manage any conflict of interest. The inquiry found that in at least 1 instance, the trustees had even decided on their own remuneration levels. And thirdly, poor financial management. The inquiry found that the annual accounts were consistently filed late, that accounting records did not properly account for the church's income and expenditure, that cash withdrawals were not supported by sufficient documentation to determine how the cash was spent, and there was a suspicion that funds donated to the church were not being recorded in the church's accounts. So not surprisingly, the inquiry found that the trustees had failed to comply with their statutory duty to keep proper accounting records. Now, whilst this inquiry suggests that these church trustees had significant disregard for both the regulations and the regulator, all trustees should be aware of the changing regulatory environment in which churches and charities operate. Ignorance of the regulatory framework is not a defence at a time when more professionalism is expected of all trustees. These type of commission reports are a poor witness for the Christian church, and in particular go against the teaching in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 about submission to authorities, and also that in 2 Corinthians 8 about doing what is right in the eyes of man as well as the eyes of God. So what is it that we can learn? This appears to be a somewhat extreme case, but there are still things that we can all take on board. Time and again, issues arise when payments are made to trustees. So before making a payment to a trustee, first, make sure that payments are allowed by your governing document or specifically allowed by the Charity Commission. Second, manage those conflicts of interest properly. Record the conflict. Ask the trustee and any connected persons, that is normally close relatives, to leave the meeting when conflicted issues arrive. Make sure that after conflicted trustees have left, the meeting still has a quorum to make decisions. And make sure the actions taken are clearly documented in the minutes of the meeting. Third, for reimbursed expenses, make sure that the nature of the reimbursement is clear. Maintain proper supporting documentation. Avoid round sum allowances unless treating them as part of remuneration. And 4, look out for the smell test. How would other people perceive the payments? All above board or a bit whiffy? Now, we'll send links to the full inquiry and also to CC11, which is the Commission's own guidance on trustee expenses and payments.
Thank you, Alan. That's some great stuff there. For those of you who've just joined us, please accept our apologies for the link not working for Zoom, but we will be recording this and sending out the podcast, so please don't fret, you've not missed out. And yeah, for the rest of you, don't forget that if you have any questions about our topics on the call today, you'll simply need to click on the chat icon on your screen, select all panelists and type in your questions. Okay, now Jackie, Jackie's going to be talking about looking after your workers.
Thank you. Yes, well, this article is not to bring you information resulting from new legislation, but rather it's run through of some of the pitfalls that arise when you have people working in your charity or church. You may think that you don't have any employees and therefore this isn't for you, but nothing would happen in your organisation if you didn't have workers. It's just that some are paid and some are not. The people who work for you are the face of your church or charity. They witness who you are and what you stand for. It stands to reason then that you'll want them to be happy and full of enthusiasm about your mission or ministry. It's very easy to let things run along and hope that your workers remain positive. But if they are to feel valued and like they have an important contribution to make, then this will take a little effort on your part. So we'll begin with employees. And the first thing to consider is ensuring that your workers have everything they need to do a good job. Are the right resources available? Do they have the training that they need? Are there opportunities for them to improve their knowledge and skills? These are all important if you wish your workers to find fulfillment in their role for you. One way of ensuring this is to hold annual appraisals. This may seem like an inconvenience, but it does ensure that your workers are doing the job that they have been appointed to do and that you value them by showing an interest in their development. Linked to this is communication. Do your workers have regular opportunities to raise any concerns or issues? Do they have access to a supportive line manager? In addition to an annual appraisal, at which performance can be measured and pay increases approved, many organisations also hold regular informal conversations with their workers to make sure that they are meeting their targets and have a voice in what is happening in their workplace. As employees are paid on a monthly basis, why not meet at the same time to ensure that things are going smoothly? Listening to your employees and acting on their concerns is actually a huge benefit to your organisation. It means that issues do not go unresolved, and it goes some way to preventing serious problems, which can lead to the breakdown of relationships and even costly employment tribunals. And if you think this couldn't happen here, then let me refer you to a very recent case, not even a month ago, where a small Scottish Christian charity was instructed to pay more than £100,000 after a tribunal ruled that they had unfairly dismissed their former centre manager. These things do happen in the world of Christian charities and churches, and they are really not a great witness to God's love and salvation. In order to ensure that all parties know their responsibilities, employees should have a written contract, which is a legal requirement. We'll talk more about that another time. And also a job description. This provides clarity for all parties, particularly in circumstances where an employee is not meeting their obligation. It gives a clear starting point for those discussions. Not all of the above will be relevant for your volunteers, but much of it can be adapted to make sure that responsibilities are clearly defined. For example, rather than a contract, you may introduce a volunteer agreement. This will outline the role of the volunteer, reimbursement of expenses, when and where their duties take place, confidentiality, and they can also outline conduct in your organisation's statement of faith. And if you're interested in purchasing a draft that you can adapt, then they are available on our website. We'd also recommend communicating regularly with your volunteers, making sure that they feel well supported in their role. Just a quick note on payments to volunteers. It's important to express your thanks for the time and the work that they do, but please do not pay them for any work done. In the eyes of HMRC, once a volunteer is paid, then they become an employee or paid worker and subject to the full extent of employment legislation, including the national minimum wage. And we'll talk more about that another time as well. So employment law does have some very specific requirements. If you have any questions or any issues, we would recommend taking professional advice. For now, it just remains for me to say that good HR and effective management of your workers is not a hindrance, but is actually a huge help. Not only because you will be seen to have done everything that you can in the hopefully rare event that things do go wrong, but more importantly, because it gives every opportunity to get the best out of your workers, which is a significant benefit to the work and witness of your organisation.
Thank you, Jackie. Some really important reminders there. So our final longer term issue is on the subject of pensions and church charity employees and is brought to you by Alan.
Brilliant, thank you. So just to say at the outset that stewardship is not authorised to give investment. To raise awareness of what is an important issue and to provide some observations of what we see happening in churches and Christian charities. So where is it that we're headed? I want to start by looking at some general background, then take a look at a few numbers. What will I need in retirement? How can I fund that? How much will I need to save? What about the state pension? And if I'm part of an auto-enrollment scheme, will that be enough? before finishing by looking at what we are seeing happening among churches and Christian charities that we serve here at Stewardship. So let's start with some background. We all know that we're generally living longer. All things being equal, it is thought that around 1/4 of people currently aged 20 will live to be 100. Now, whilst for most people this is a good thing, it does mean a longer retirement, maybe 25 years or even more. This might sound idyllic, but it will have to be paid for somehow. Now, although this change in demographic has long been known, it's only in the more recent years that the government has started to act. On one front, by pushing back the age for receiving the state pension, and on another, by encouraging workers and employers to save more by introducing pension auto-enrolment, thereby forcing employees to actively opt out if they do not want to be part of a pension arrangement. So what about those numbers? How do those pension numbers stack up? Well, all the figures that we're using today come from a Which article entitled How Much Will You Need to Retire? And we'll send the links for that at the end of this call. And they're quoted in today's values, meaning that they are not adjusted for inflation. So let's try and break it down step by step. Step one, what is it that you might need? So what's the sort of level of income you think you might need in retirement? Well, the article offers 3 lifestyles of retirement: essential, comfortable, and luxurious, suggesting that a retired couple living a comfortable retirement would spend around £27,000 per year. Now, obviously, different figures apply for single people. Now, whilst these are, of course, estimated figures, and they will be impacted by things like where you live and even what you might consider to be either essential, comfortable, or luxurious, but do take note, they only allow for around £3,000 per year on housing payments, which means they do not include either mortgage repayments or property rental. This might be a real issue for church workers, particularly those where a manse has been provided, and as a result, the worker may not have invested in property in a personal capacity at all. So let's run with that £27,000 per year target as the couple's expenditure target to go forward. How might they look to fund that? So, okay, so we have a target now. What is it that we can use to fund that gap? There are 3 basic income sources that could make up the figure. Firstly, there is the state pension. Secondly, there might be savings or a legacy, even some part-time income or employment. And thirdly, a personal or employment-based pension. Let's start with the state pension. Based on 35 years of national insurance contributions, the new state pension at full value pays £168.60 per week per person. That's around £8,750 each year. However, the average payout is currently near £150 per week, indicating that in many cases the necessary 35 years of NI contributions have not been reached. This is another area where Christian workers may suffer more than most, particularly workers who have spent time on the mission field and may not have made NI contributions for many years. While some of those years may be able to be topped up, it could still leave workers on a reduced state pension. And remember that most employees will not be entitled to receive a state pension until reaching the age of either 67 or 68. So for our couple seeking that £27,000 income target, based on average payouts, the state pension will take account of around £15,500. A good start, but still leaving a gap of some £11,500. As we mentioned, our couple may have other sources of income or savings. But in this example, let's put all those to one side and assume that the £11,500 gap has to be filled with another form of personal or employment-based pension, one that builds an investment pot from pension contributions, sometimes called a defined contribution scheme. So step 3, how big does my pot need to be? So what will it take to build a pot big enough to fill that £11,500 gap? Well, that depends. Pensions are complex and can take several forms, and the amount that you need in your pot will depend on the type of pension you take. A qualified independent financial advisor will help explain the different possibilities that are available. The Which article calculates that for a drawdown pension, an investment pot of £215,000 is required to fund that gap. This rises to almost £300,000 if the pot is used to purchase an annuity. But for now, let's see what it will take to build that pot of £215,000. So step 4, how big will my pension contributions need to be? Well, the level of contributions required to build a pot from scratch will depend upon your age, investment returns, and tax laws. Again, which have calculated that under the current tax regime, and with an average investment return of 3%, a couple aged 20 would require contributions of £271 per month to reach the desired pot of £215,000. This rises to £352 per month if the couple are aged 30 and £489 per month if they are aged 40. Now remember, these are total contributions and can come either from the employer or the employee. Step 5, will the auto-enrolment pension be enough? Well, under auto-enrolment, unless the employee has chosen to opt out, the minimum contributions to a pension scheme is now 8% of pensionable salary. Note, this is not always the same as total salary. Contributions under auto-enrolment are generally and yet with financial pressures on housing and perhaps children, younger employees often struggle to contribute anything at all to a pension, and for fear of having amounts deducted from their own salary, may even choose to opt out of the auto-enrolled pensions altogether. This means that pension savings will not start until they are older, thereby requiring greater contribution levels. So this is where the employers can play a part. As we said, employers are not restricted in the level of contributions they can make and can alleviate the pressure on employees by contributing to a pension at the full auto-enrolment pension rate of 8% or even higher if they choose. So what is it that we're seeing? Using our own payroll bureau to provide a flavour of what is happening, and based on all
Included in the follow-up email is a very, very brief survey that should take around 3 minutes to complete. I'm sure the inbox is full of them. However, we are currently reviewing the best how best we can allocate our resources in supporting churches and charities. So it's particularly helpful at this time if you can let us know what you think of this service. We'd like to know what we're doing well and whether there is anything else that that you would like for us to include. Ultimately, we are here to serve you, and so really appreciate you taking the time to help us in this way. Our next dial-in will be on Thursday, the 18th of June 2020, and we will be sending you the details for it shortly. We hope you will be available to